Softly now the light of day fades upon our sight away. Free from care, from labor free, Lord, we would commune with thee. Oh, Father in heaven, we come before you once more to give you praise and thanks for the blessings of the day and for the word that we heard today. As we enter this evening's program, I ask, dear God, that you, through the Holy Spirit, will be with us. As Brother Leighton presents his topic, I ask, dear God, that we would listen attentively and that we would learn something that would benefit us, and also we might be able to pass on to others. So be with us all here, remembering Sister Blair, and we thank you for the good report that we just had. So as we go through this evening, we ask your continued guidance over whatever will be done. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
I'm still muted. Thank you for the prayer, Sister Diane. At this time, we will be having our theme song, Free by K. Anthony.
When I lift my eyes to the hills, I remember where my help comes from. There's no darkness that your light can put out. Your glory is my mercy, and forever I wanna be praising your name for how you set me free. Whom the sun sets free, oh, is free indeed. Everything I was, you cast into the sea. Your forgiveness is my only memory, as I simply be one whom the sun sets free. When I lift my eyes to the King, I remember all that matters.
The picture that we would do.
There's nothing that I've done where I can boast. I'd still be in chains were it not for grace. So I will sing of how you set me free. Whom the sun sets free, oh, is free indeed. Everything I was, you cast into the sea. Your forgiveness is my only memory, as I simply be one whom the sun sets free. Your forgiveness is my only memory, as I simply be one whom the sun sets free. As I simply be one whom the sun sets free.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So at this time, we are going to be hearing from the speaker of the hour, and his topic will be the effects of COVID-19 on our mental health. And although COVID might not affect some of us physically, as in we have not contracted the virus, but I am sure during this pandemic, you can all attest to the fact that COVID has some effect on us mentally as well as socially. So you'll be hearing from Leighton Kennedy, but let me tell you a little bit about him. I don't know if you can see his face on the screen, but he looks like two individuals that I know. He looks like the pastor of our church. You know why? Because he's actually the son of our dear beloved pastor and Sister June Kennedy. Leighton Kennedy is a nurse practitioner with a specialty in psychiatry, who completed his undergraduate degree as a nurse from the former Atlantic Union College, and he's a graduate of University of Massachusetts, Amherst to be specific. Now, over the last 20 plus years, he's lived a variety of places between Massachusetts and Maryland and recently Minnesota. He has enjoyed working with children to adults with mood disorders, anxiety problems, trauma issues, and adjustment challenges. He is not just a nurse practitioner, but he's an entrepreneur. He is a co-owner of Innova Life LLC. It is a psychiatric private practice in Laurel, Maryland. He's been at this for the past 6 years. He always seeks to treat people with the utmost respect and dignity while partnering with them in pursuing the most effective approaches to treatment so that they can thrive. When he's not working with patients, he's often found playing his saxophone for churches. And if you ever heard him play, he can play. He plays at events, even virtually throughout this pandemic, just trying to bring love and joy and peace to the hearts of others. He is super proud to be connected to 3 wonderful females, and those are his biggest supporters. His lovely wife, Jessica, of 23 years, his college daughter. I know he does not look so old to have a daughter in college, but his college daughter, Janicia, and his high school daughter, Lavani. But if you look at the father, you see that he has good genes, so they don't show their ages. They look young all the time. Through the pandemic, he has grown to love hiking with his family and has grown to trust and depend on God more. And now he seeks to be a more useful resource to people. So I think he is more than qualified to present on this topic tonight. And I look forward to learning and also for us to apply whatever it is that he will share with us. I will hand over to him at this time.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, I feel pretty blessed to be able to take this opportunity and be given this opportunity to be able to share about mental health, because it's an area that I'm already working in, something I know about, and it's always useful and really helpful to be able to share that knowledge with people who are seeking better ways to manage their health, especially now. And so I'm going to just spend some time going over some general areas of mental health, specifically in the pandemic. And hopefully something will stick with you. The thing I want you to take home is really observing and understanding signs of mental health symptoms. And it's important to be able to recognize these things because you'll see it around you and you'll have better eyes for what may be going on for yourself, for your children, for your family members. And then the second thing is I want you to know how to get help, where to get help. Because many times, as you've heard in other presentations, we're not going out and getting the help because of fear. And I think it's important that we look at getting the right help so that we can work through this crisis together. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share, and we're going to go ahead and get right into the topic. And I call this topic the crisis of confinement. The crisis of confinement, mental health in COVID-19 pandemic. But I want you to think about today's date. Today's September 11th. It's 20 years past the date when we had the crisis that hit New York City and Washington, D.C. And as I look at this picture, 20 years removed, I still have similar emotions, and my brain goes right back to when I first saw this image. And so I think about when I was living in Massachusetts and where I was. And I put September 13th, it was actually September 11th. September 11th, 2001. I was working for an agency. It was a nonprofit agency in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, where I was a nurse manager, going into a manager's meeting. And on that morning, our typical focus on Tuesdays was to go in and begin to look at all the children and adolescents that we were serving, who struggled with social, emotional, and behavioral issues. And so, give me a second. I'm gonna. I apologize. Can you see this? Can you see this? Can you hear me?
Yes.
No,
I
nothing is showing.
apologize. I just want to make sure I get the right image going again. Just reshare. I do apologize. Sorry for my pause. Trying to make sure we get the right screen because I think you're seeing my timer.
Yes.
I do apologize. And let's see if we can get that fixed. How about now? Is that better?
We're not seeing anything.
How about now?
Yes.
Perfect.
All right, perfect. Thank you. And so I go in to the meeting, which was actually occurring in a house. And the first thing that I saw was something that was very unusual. It was my team of managers sitting in front of a television, watching the news. And the first image that I saw as soon as I turned to the television was the second plane going into the towers. And instead of meeting, or everyone sat on a couch or sat at a table encircling the television, thinking about what was next. I thought about the emotions that I went through. It was an absolute shock, and it was kind of surreal because never in my life had I witnessed anything like that. And the TV watching didn't stop just on that day, because even on the 12th and on the 13th and on the 14th and each day following, the same images were played over and over on the news. The plane hitting the towers and the plane hitting the Pentagon. What was experienced that day was a significant trauma to a nation. A government that seems so invincible, yet its vulnerability was shown that day. And even then, 20 years later, we're still having to think about that trauma. Where were you? Think about where you were. What were you doing? What kind of emotions were you going through? Until today, do you still experience those emotions? I heard a statement this morning that says, I reminded, does time heal all wounds? Well, is that the reality? Apparently not. Time doesn't heal wounds. At least that's not what I learned in my books. When I get a wound, time is not the healer. But over time, things can improve if certain things are put in place. There's a story during the tragedy, 20 years later, looking at a first responder from the 9/11. Now he's about in his 60s and he was exposed to the devastation of lost lives. He saw the destruction of property and he was exposed to the toxic environment from the collapsed buildings in Manhattan. 2010, he suffers a stroke and he had to relearn to walk again. He's dealing with peripheral neuropathy, which is basically the numbness and the deadening of his nerves and his nerve endings and extremities, which possibly was coming from the toxic exposure at ground zero. Today, he attempts to stay active. He tries to enjoy his life with his wife and 7 children and 9 grandchildren. Yet he continues to live with the emotional scar of 9/11. But he tries not to think about it in order to try to move on. Many today still suffer from the tragedy, and it didn't only impact the first responders, it impacted families and beyond. At that site, almost 3,000 people died. 3,000. And as long as 9 months after that impact on 9/11, residents in the surrounding areas were exposed to the wreckage. And so you could understand that being exposed to that memory and seeing that image on a daily basis could have long-lasting effects. 20 years later, according to the CDC, these are the top 10 health conditions: chronic rhinosinusitis, GERD, cancers, asthma, sleep apnea, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic respiratory disorders, World Trade Center exacerbated chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, anxiety, major depressive disorder. So even 20 years later, we see the lasting effects of a major trauma. Well, COVID-19 is a different story. Yet it still has the same impact and will continue to have impact with us. Let's go back and see that what was traced back to Wuhan, China, which may have started in November of 2019, first reported in the US in Washington State, February of 2020. And as soon as we felt that we were in major crisis mode, it was moved that we shut down business, and many businesses were shut down. Just giving you the short story. There is much more happening because we've all lived it. Many persons lost their jobs and their income. This was happening not only on US soil, but this was global. And so it was called the pandemic, and still is. Progressive social distancing and masking protocols implemented. Rapid shifts to virtual learning for students occurred. And what we saw amidst this at the beginning, political polarization grew amidst presidential elections, protests for greater racial justice due to police brutality towards Blacks and others. Tensions around immigration persisted. We saw the stock market drop, and there was a lot of hysteria going on over the months following February 2020. And yeah, the so popular Washington, D.C. Capitol Hill, stormed by citizens, termed the insurrection as we moved throughout the pandemic. And so you can see that there were so many big things that we're watching and we are being witnesses to on the news. And people were having so many emotions and so many comments and trying to struggle to figure out, what do I believe and what do I side with? And how do I deal with the stress of this on a daily basis? And those were just things on a daily basis that were associated and continue to be associated with this pandemic. But yet, people still deal with stresses on a daily basis, with losses that have nothing to do with COVID. Yet still, people had to deal with those things even amidst all the pressure. We saw the statistics on a daily basis. Here's the statistics from the CDC from February 2020, as we see the rising of the cumulative cases, starting from 0 all the way up with the reporting up to September 8th, 2021. We're seeing cases of COVID at 40 million, just over 40 million cases in the United States alone. It's pretty significant. And then simultaneous to that, the deaths, we saw the death tolls. On a daily basis, we were bombarded with hearing losses after loss to COVID. I remember I had a patient who came into my office and she began to talk. She met me for the first time and she began to talk about the amount of loss that she was dealing with. And she said that 7 people in her family in the 2-month period died. 4 people from COVID, and then a couple of other people from cardiac arrest, and I think the other person probably for some unknown reason. So what we're seeing is significant loss, not only with the cumulative death toll, but also people having to deal with regular daily life, at least what seemed to be regular, daily life traumas and loss. Here are the trends, just to show you the waves of death tolls. And if we recall, early on in this pandemic, where we see the spike right here, there's a lot of talk about funerals and how we were going to have funerals and how are we going to bury people. We saw in other countries what was happening, where people could not have a regular funeral and left the hospitals and were buried right outside of the hospitals, and families weren't able to have their last looks at their family members. That is the COVID-19 story, at least from the death perspective and the cases from COVID. The effects of the crisis, we're dealing with loss of physical health, where people, even after getting COVID, they're still dealing with long-term effects, long-term fatigue, neurological issues, and other issues. Loss of more loved ones by other causes, feeling trapped, not being able to leave, a lost sense of security, loss of physical closeness, loss of jobs, loss of emotional control, and I go as far as to say loss of trust. What did we predict? And when the pandemic began and when we were talking about shutting and doing lockdowns, there was a prediction in the rise of mental health disorders, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, such as social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic stress reactions, and then grief reactions. These were all things that were concerns when the lockdown was talked about. And so we're looking at other trends in the early pandemic. 13% of Americans reported starting or increased substance abuse to cope with the stress or emotions related to COVID-19. So you heard about people drinking more in order to deal with the emotions, the stress, the anxiety, the irritability, the nervousness, the low moods, the caution, the fear. There are also spikes in opioid overdoses. Remember, before 2020, we were talking about the opioid crisis and the fact that there were people who were dying and overdosing, and we needed to do something very different. And there were policies that were put in place. And we thought we'd try to get things under control with that crisis. But as the pandemic hit, this is what happened. Opioid use and death started to spike. 40 states in December of 2020, months in, had seen increases in opioid-related mortality, with ongoing concerns for those substance use disorders. April of 2020, we talked about people being confined in the same spaces for long periods of time. Divorce started to rise. More interpersonal conflict, marital conflict. There's an increase in divorce by 34% in the US. And 20% of newer couples, 5 months or less, seeking divorce during this time. So the 20% increase. 11% of new couples sought divorce in 2019 around the same period of time. And here was an interesting fact, and it was pretty disturbing actually when I saw it. Gun owners had increased during the lockdowns and witnessing all that was happening with violence or protests and racial and civil unrest. They increased gun access in their homes to their teens. Due to fear of violence. And we already know that greater access to guns would increase, especially with young people and children. There were greater deaths, accidental deaths, and we knew those numbers before, but yet parents felt like they needed to make, gun-owning parents felt like they needed to make that decision. And so I share this. This is the new stress test we just put on the news. Funny and yet real, because for myself, I felt that same thing. Every time I turn on the news, here comes another opinion. Here comes a repeat of the same thing. And so I decided I'm going to shut off the news. And I even heard this from my parents as well, that they were going to try to shut off the news, not watch as much news as possible, but still try to be keeping our ears to what's going on. What I did was spend more time in reading. That way I can really manage my consumption. So I just wanted to look at the idea of mental health and mental health symptoms in a few categories. I think this is a review for this church, because we went through this months back in talking about different mental health disorders, but looking at symptoms. And so let's think about this. What are the symptoms of depression? Persistent sadness or empty moods. Irritability and anger typically are additional things that children and teens may experience, and more specific to them, yet adults can experience that same thing. How about the feelings of hopelessness or pessimism? Feelings of guilt, worthlessness, helplessness, loss of interest, or pleasure in hobbies, activities? Have you felt fatigued in getting out of bed? Feeling slow and not wanting to go to the next activity? Difficulty concentrating on your tasks or remembering, or even having a difficult time making decisions? And how about the issue of insomnia? Falling asleep, not being able to fall asleep, waking up early in the morning, or the opposite, being hypersomnic, sleeping too much, sleeping 12 hours, 18 hours. And then other issues affecting the appetite, low appetite and weight loss, or overeating, emotionally eating, and gaining a lot of weight. And then the final symptom, thoughts of death or suicide attempts. These are the classic signs that we see in depression. Just take a picture of that. That's important to know those signs, because I want you to be able to recognize those signs in either yourself or in other people who may be in your household. Because it's important that when we start to see these things start to persist beyond just regular sadness, then we have to figure out, what are we going to do to get help for this individual or for ourselves? I said with the pandemic that depression was on the rise. Anxiety as well. I talked about generalized anxiety and social anxiety. It means anxieties in social situations. And so people who deal with anxiety, here are the symptoms. And it will probably go beyond this because there's still culturally and gender specific symptoms that may go along with this. But I'm just focusing on the basics. Excessive worry. Are you worrying about things just constantly? Are you feeling like those thoughts are just out of control and you can't really settle your mind down? How about feeling agitated or restless? Again, fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, tense muscles, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, social avoidance, irrational fear, and panic attacks. Sometimes these symptoms even show up as much as people having physical symptoms, chest pain that seems to make people feel like they're having a heart attack, nausea, vomiting, excessive sweating, tremors, and headaches, and a number of other things. But again, these things are begun to, or have continued to rise and affecting many, many people. And then the issue of post-traumatic stress. Did we witness a trauma? Some people wonder, but some people are experiencing traumas within this climate. And as I talked to you about people not being able to go to certain events, especially at the beginning, with the losses in their family. But there are other traumas that happen even under this period of time. And either physical, emotional, sexual abuse, or just even just watching the ongoing images of the discriminatory practices within the country or what's happening with the shootings. Those things were pretty significant for many people. And so people begin to deal with intrusive memories. They start to have distressive memories about the traumatic event, or they deal with flashbacks, meaning that they're having sensory experiences that remind them of the event that had gone on, and so they feel like they're reliving that experience. People also deal with upsetting dreams or nightmares about the event or theme related to the event. And so they have a hard time getting back to sleep. And that impacts sleep in and of itself because over time, people have fear of going to sleep because they're going to have that recurring nightmare or terror for that night. People also deal with severe emotional distress and physical reactions to something that remind them of the traumatic event. There's also avoidance thinking or talking about the traumatic event. Avoidance of places, activities, or people that remind you of the traumatic event. And then there's also negative changes in thinking and mood. Changes in physical and emotional reactions. So people are easily startled. So sometimes people may be approached from the side or or from the behind them, and they may jump, or they may be touched slightly, and they may have a reaction. Or maybe there's people who are always on guard, double checking, they're hyper vigilant, they're always checking for danger, they're locking all their doors. They have a habit of locking all their doors before they go to bed, they're making sure the stove is shut off, or they're going down the street and they're always checking their back. I laugh at this particular symptom for me personally, because every time I go into New York City, my wife talks about how my demeanor changes. And so when you go into city life, you know what city life is like. And so your antennas are always up. So you're always checking. But that in of itself doesn't mean you have PTSD. But at the same time, it's something that can be a part of a list of symptoms. The other thing that happens with people who suffer with PTSD, and we've seen this with not only veterans, but in children and adults who've been survivors of trauma, they get involved in self-destructive behaviors in order to be able to suppress and avoid the traumatic symptoms, the memories and the flashbacks. They end up drinking and having more issues with substance abuse, more risk-taking behavior, driving fast, really having less fear of death in and of itself, because that seems much better than the pain that they're going through. Again, difficulty sleeping, and then irritability and anger outbursts. And with young children, reenacting the traumatic event or aspects of traumatic events through play. And sometimes the traumatic events, when you see children playing with their toys, sometimes if you pay attention, if that's an experience that a child has had, you will see that there may be partial or reenactments or full reenactments of what may have happened to them. And so that's something that actually does get looked at by child therapists who engage in play therapy, to be able to look at how kids experience their life. They are able to play that out in play. And finally, frightening dreams that may or may not include aspects of the traumatic event. So that was a mouthful for 3 disorders, but I have to be able to just touch on this. We did a presentation on this months ago on grief. And with all the loss, we do have to acknowledge that we're all grieving, and grieving together in some way. Whether it's from the deaths in our families or in our communities, or what we've witnessed, people are grieving loss of normalcy, loss of being able to be at school, loss of friendships and disconnection. And though those things are being lifted now, know that kids have gone back into school and things have changed, yet we're still having to deal with the prolonged events that we've been dealing with the shutdown. So similar symptoms that people are dealing with are similar to traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. And I just figured I just put the stages of grief and bereavement that was put out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in 1969. Stages of denial, not believing and really not recognizing or not wanting to recognize that the event happened. Or how about anger? Or how about bargaining, depression, and acceptance? And those stages, as I've talked before, they don't necessarily go in that order. They may happen in different orders. And you may come to a stage of acceptance, but still you may end up going back through that process again, those stages. So it's just, I just wanted to share grieving, the stages of grief. The effects of the crisis. I just looked at a study of adolescents right at the top of the pandemic. There was a study in Long Island, New York. There were 2 longitudinal studies that were happening between 2014 and 2019 on anxiety and depression. And so 451 adolescents and young adults in Long Island who had pre-existing depression and anxiety were restudied to look at if there was going to be any sort of change in their anxiety and depression scores. And so in March of 2020, they were tested for anxiety and depression. They were screened. And then again in May of 2020, they were rescreened. And it was certain that after the lockdown, that there was a spike in anxiety, and there's also a change in their depression scores. And so what was interesting is that there, again, universal increase in generalized anxiety and social anxiety symptoms. And the results show that females, they seem to have more depression and panic or somatic symptoms. Somatic symptoms meaning more physical complaints of anxiety. And that's actually consistent with just the general prevalence of depression and anxiety, but it's consistent with that, but the national prevalence as females dealing with more depression, having higher depression, but doesn't mean that men have not been significantly affected by what was happening during the lockdown. Depression symptoms were associated with greater COVID-19 school concerns, and then greater home confinement concerns were unequally associated with increased generalized anxiety symptoms and decreased social anxiety symptoms. Other things that affected mental health of the adolescents during this time, they looked at stressful life events. Again, stressful life events, divorce of parents, and just things that were happening in the home, breakups with their significant others, extended home confinement, feeling trapped, not, again, looking at the issue of just being confined and not having normal life to be able to socialize. Brutal grief, intrafamiliar violence. There was more time spent at home. There was violence that was happening. If there was violence and tension in the home before the pandemic, more time spent together, there was an increase. And then the other issue that I figure I wanted to point on, because I see this and I talk about this a lot with parents, the overuse of the internet and social media. There's this mass push of information during this time, just a boom over COVID-19 pandemic. And just talking to parents, I would have young people and their parents sitting, and I'd ask this question. Well, you're home on the lockdown, and you'd find out that kids' sleep patterns were all over the place. And so it seemed like what was the summer sleep pattern when school time, virtual schooling started, the sleep pattern was just the same. Kids were going to bed at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Parents didn't know when their kids were going to sleep. And so it asked the question, what were you doing? Oh, I was just up. Not really doing much. But what was happening is that kids were staying up on the internet, staying up and continue to stay up on the internet, just scrolling through social media and just getting caught in rabbit holes, watching videos on violence or watching videos related to everything that they feared. There's a term that came up called doom scrolling. I don't know if you heard that, but doom scrolling really is just the compulsive behavior of surfing the internet for answers to our fears through through various media. And it seems to feel good in the moment, but it has several adverse effects, including increased anxieties and depression, and also increasing sedentary lifestyle. So you notice I asked a question when I asked them, young people, to look at their phones. What does the app say? How much time have you been spending on the screen today? They'll say 12 hours. Outside of schoolwork, 12 hours, 13 hours. It's a lot of hours being on the screen. The Pediatric Association years ago had suggested that parents shouldn't allow their kids to be on screens for more than 2 hours. But the pandemic blew that wide open because they needed to be in virtual school. And so all barriers and boundaries were shut down by parents because they felt kids need to socialize or needed something to do. And so now we have increased viewership and open access to the internet. And what we were also noticing were increased gambling behaviors. If you notice, there's a lot of opportunity to gamble on sports. Well, young people and adults were caught up in gambling. And then, of course, the pornography industry, as well as the gambling industry, take advantage. Everybody's at home. We have your attention. And so there was also increase in addictions that were noticed. And the dangerous thought that people may have, it says, I'll be able to stop this once the COVID pandemic is over. I'll be able to stop this before the pandemic is over. Look how long we've been in this pandemic. How many months? 20? 20 months. And it's not over yet. We talked about mental health and what was happening in the pandemic, but I just want to check some statistics and some issues around mental health. Back in 2016, and looking at the racial disparities, and if you look at this pie graph, excuse me, let me just back up. It says approximately mental health, as far as mental health is concerned, approximately 18% of US adults have a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. And approximately 4% of adults have a serious mental illness. Serious mental illness could be major depression, bipolar disorder, a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. Mental and behavioral disorders are among the leading causes of disability in the US, accounting for 13.6% of all years of life lost to disability and premature death. Mental disorders are among the top most costly health conditions for adults 18 to 64 in the US, along with cancer and trauma-related disorders. And that would be physical trauma. And there's an estimated 43% of people with any mental illness receiving mental health counseling. If you look at this pie graph, you'll notice that it says 62%, approximately 62% of the people diagnosed with mental health disorder in the US are people who identify as white. And then in 18% are Hispanic, 13% Black, 6% Asian, 1% American Indian or Alaskan, and then it's like a 0.2% percentage for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. Now you're saying, you know, Blacks and Hispanics and what they call statistical minorities, so to speak, or people of color, seem to have less, but I'd wonder about the issue of reporting. You know, there's still the issue of reporting this information. Some of the barriers that people have had, and I've noticed that there are many people who still struggle with coming into mental health care, particularly amongst people of color. And so what you'll see is that amongst the people who have been diagnosed or people who are looking to receive care, you'll see approximately 40-something% of Caucasian or white, people who identify as white, people who identify as Black, between the 25 and 37%, and Hispanic also fall within that range. These are the people who are receiving care. And so the percentage of people getting care, and I'm sorry, I didn't put those numbers right on the bars, but percentage of people receiving care amongst people of color are statistically significantly lower than people who identify as white. And then the two or more are people who identify as multiracial or multi-ethnic. So I don't have a breakdown of those numbers, but this is just statistical data and looking at that. But reasons for barriers to care: lack of insurance, underinsured. How about mental health stigma? Often people of people of color, people come from different backgrounds who are not Caucasian, tend to have a greater stigma toward mental health. And a lot of times, some of it is because people in their families are not talking about mental health. They may notice that someone in their family may not be functioning emotionally or behaviorally normal, but no one's really talking about it. And so there are things that may be passed down. But I am noticing that people are now beginning to break away, especially during the pandemic, to try to seek out some help and care for their own mental health. There's also a lack of diversity among mental health providers. And so there are a smaller percentage of Black or Latino or Asian providers to be able to service communities of color. And what that brings about is the issue of cultural competence amongst providers. And so what a lot of times I've been hearing now is that my clients have been coming, my patients have been coming in, and they said they did a search. I'm looking for a Black provider. And that's what they put in the Google search. And what comes up? They said my picture shows up. I laugh about it, but it seems it's something that's very important to them because they want someone to identify with right off the bat, so that they don't have to tell their story about who they are. There's somebody who's there who can understand. So diversity amongst providers. That's actually a call to, I'm going to put out this call to mental health people who are thinking about what they'd like to do with their life. There's a great need for Black and Latino and Asian and other people from diverse backgrounds in doing mental health, because people are suffering, especially through this pandemic and beyond, to be able to get help and to be able for people to feel comfortable, to be able to talk about what's going on and seeing how they can do something differently than what they're doing currently. We also need people who are culturally competent and also people who may speak the language of the patients who are seeking help. And that's very important. And hopefully this will continue, will start to build some trust in a healthcare system where people have had a lot of mistrust. What's been happening to help? I saw that right at the top of the pandemic, a lot of policies were significantly changed in order to provide open access for mental health to many people. The government policies were expanded, and so telehealth services for mental health services were able to cross state lines so that people did not have any lapse in their treatment, so that they weren't coming off of their medications or having breaks in providers, because that would promote greater risk in the midst of new oncoming episodes of depression, anxiety, and traumatic stress. And so it was really important for this to happen. And what I saw for my own practice, there was a boom in the number of people who were coming and reaching out for help because of either loss of job or job stress, new onset of depression, or just looking for a provider who may understand them. This was atypical because before there were a lot more laws and rules around telehealth, and now that seemed to really shift to now break down barriers. There's still disparities, and it's something that continues to be being worked on, but it's definitely opening up avenues for people to seek out help. There's been greater education that's been happening. Right at the top of the pandemic, again, and through the pandemic, I myself and many providers, practitioners, medical providers have been invited to be able to talk about mental health problems and talk about health issues and be able to change perception about mental health. That it's not something that you can just push through, but it's something that actually does have are now seen as medical problems, not just a problem in your head, and you just go push through it. Zoom meetings technology has been used. TikTok has been an avenue that has been used in order to be able to deliver education, to be able to bring greater understanding to our communities. And then non-traditional forms of treatment have been invented. Apps, things like Headspace and the Calm app, used for people to work on relaxation and using different tips, cognitive behavioral ways of being able to shift your thinking and be able to work on behaviors, and other ways of opening up resources for people to look for help. Many other things have happened, and yet still there are not enough mental health professionals to meet the significant needs. But there are a couple of things that we need to really look at in order to be able to help in this pandemic. And we've been doing a lot of these things, but I'm going to encourage us to continue to do these things during the pandemic and during this time and even beyond, even when they say that the pandemic is done. Increased connection. Connectivity is so important. That was a big piece of why people began to experience anxieties, but communication with each other. I like what the churches have been doing and have continued to do. There's been increased connection through Zoom meetings, church connection. And it's actually invigorated the life of many people. They talk about, I've talked to many elderly people who've talked about the virtual meetings have really made a difference for them, especially because many of them were feeling alone where their family members could not visit. Then that phenomenon of drive-bys came up, drive-by celebrations, drive-by parties. That was a way of attempting to continue to make connection. And people have noticed that has made some difference for them. The issue of safe gatherings, people masked and trying to gather in small groups and finding different ways to just be normal. Virtual and hybrid church, going to the park. I told you that was something that I started doing a lot more of during the pandemic and during this time, because nature therapy is so important. It's so important for my mental health. And it's important for your mental wellness. Being able to be amidst the flowers, be able to go for walks with family, going on hikes safely. And this last one, I just think about a young lady who was very hysterical about her mom allowing people in her home who may potentially have COVID. And the mom had definitely a pre-existing condition. And she was fretting all the time, each and every day. And I made a suggestion to her. I said, go and do something to be of service. And so she did. She came back and she said, Kennedy. I said, what's going on? You seem very happy. She says, you know what I did? I actually took your advice. I'm like, wow, that's really rare, but okay. She said, what did you? I said, what did you do? She said, I went out and volunteered at a soup kitchen. I volunteered at a soup kitchen, and it made such a difference for my anxiety. Now I'm volunteering 7 days a week. I said, oh, wow, that's a whole lot. They said, is that too much for you, or is that just enough? She says, I probably need to cut back, but it makes such a difference because I'm not overly consumed with how my mom is managing her life. I guess she's fine, but I was really struggling with it. And to be able to go out and help others in need was a big deal. So it really brought my anxieties down significantly. Like I do always, I think for everyone, it's really important to look at how we care for ourselves. Self-care is really important, and I will continue to reiterate this. Take care of yourselves. The idea of managing your sleep is really important. Let's start there. We know that many people, even if they didn't lose their jobs, the workforce may have dwindled, and yet the workload has increased for many people who are living at home and working. And so sleep schedules began to be off and continue to be off for many people. And their nights have been filled with worry about trying to finish the job and being concerned about what the boss is going to think and what pressures they were dealing with. But I encourage people to really look at setting boundaries and start setting up a regular sleep schedule, removing your phone, shutting down the scrolling, cutting down the notifications, and limiting your phone use to a certain period of time and setting that sleep schedule to reset. A disrupted sleep schedule is also, again, a sign of depression. It can be an indicator of depression, an indicator of anxiety, an indicator of dealing with trauma issues. And so it's important to figure out how can we work on setting our schedule and setting up a normal routine, set a regular time, have a sleep, a winding down pattern, and getting ourselves to sleep. Eating healthy is important. There's a lot of research that talks about eating healthy and its impact on the mood, removing that junk food, and the large amounts of sugar in our diet does have an impact on people's mood, depression. So looking at more having a colorful plate of food. I always say increasing your plant-based consumption is pretty significant, and it will help in managing some of your mental health. It's not a cure, but it helps. Get outside in the sun and do activities. Learn to take breaks, breaks from screen time, breaks from strenuous activities, take a vacation, do not overwork. And then clear out unnecessary things in your life and get organized. Unnecessary things could be toxic relationships, or it could be just unnecessary tasks and things that are in your life. You decide and look in your life, what are the things that are impacting on your mental health? Because we've been in this for a long time, and we need to be strengthened in order to continue to go on day to day. Exercise regularly. I talk about this pattern of exercise all the time with my patients. There was a review looked at the impact of exercise, that over a 3-month, when you're consistently doing exercise, cardiovascular exercise, that it's definitely better than a placebo, and it also has a pretty similar effect to an antidepressant after 3 months. Doesn't mean you can't use medication, but I'm just saying that exercise is pretty significant, and is one of those things that you can do as well in order to help yourself. Go to your primary care physician. A lot of people and I specifically look at Black folks, Black men. I heard earlier a portion of the presentation talking about Black males and their lifespan and the amount of health issues that they tend to deal with. And again, I know some of this is related to either the idea of manhood or mistrust or whatever it is. But I encourage you to go and get checked regularly. Your primary care physician can screen for depression, can screen for anxiety and mental health disorders, and will also refer for you to get help. It's important to get help. Resources, seeking out therapy, being able to talk to someone. Again, this has to do with connection, but it also has to do with self-care and caring for yourself. And don't be ashamed to talk to a therapist. I've done it for myself in my life. I've had to sit down and talk to someone in order to be able to clear out what has been affecting me. Either go to an individual, family, or group counseling. They offer there's grief counseling, there's cognitive behavioral therapy. There are different therapy styles. I encourage you to go ahead and seek out those resources. I have a couple of resources there, psychologytoday.com. It's a broad database of psychiatrists and therapists that can be of service to you. And you could filter that information, by your insurance, by the picture of the ethnicity of the person, the issues that they deal with. The other thing I put for self-care, you may need medication. And I don't want people to just think that medication for your mental health is this big, huge problem. And you may need to take something in order to help you through managing the intensity and severity of what you're dealing with. And through the use of medication, it may allow you to be able to work through some of the issues that you have been dealing with, not only related to the COVID, but also related to your life issues, the events that have happened even from your childhood. There is a link connected to Allegheny East website for mental health resources, so you can definitely go there. I put a couple of other things, doing hobbies, taking spiritual time for spiritual growth. Start your day with prayer. Start your day with a spiritual reading, a Bible verse, doing something and ending your day, practicing being grateful to God who's given you all, even in the midst of all of this. Prayer and meditation, meditating, time alone. Be able to focus on what's important. I put this picture here. This is called a plant. It's a zinnia. It's a zinnia. And so I got introduced to the zinnia by a student. I have a nurse practitioner student who has been shadowing me. And so she talked about zinnia. She says, I have zinnias in my home. And so I garden. I like gardening. And so I smiled because I hear a lot about gardening, especially during this time. I've seen pictures come from my parents and my uncles and my aunts. They share a lot about gardening. The church has probably seen some of the garden pictures because it brings sheer joy to their heart. And so she was able to talk about how she watched it grow over time and then watched it bloom after many weeks. And it produced this beautiful, beautiful zinnia. Look how colorful that is. And if you don't garden, you can always go to a botanical garden and enjoy the roses. Here's some resources again. I point these out because I don't want to ignore suicide rates and the spike of suicide rates. And I think it's important that when people are experiencing these thoughts and feel like they have intent, we have to be able to give them a quick access to someone who can be available at the text or at the call. And so I have there's a crisis hotline, crisis text care, 2741. So that's text home. And then there's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that's an 800 number. They have one number for Spanish. And then maybe in your county, there are crisis teams. If you're in crisis, a lot of times the crisis teams will come to your home instead of you having to go to the emergency room or maybe call an ambulance. But the crisis team may be able to be there to help you if you're dealing with suicide ideation, because that's a crisis issue. It's a crisis issue, and it's important to be able to help you through those instances. I put the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, NAMI, They have a helpline. It's a pretty significant organization nationally as well, because they do help many people working through mental illness, but they also talk to families to help them better understand what their family members or their friends may be going through with mental illness. So they have many resources as well. And then finally, here's my information, Nova Life LLC. And that is my presentation. And I hope that this was helpful. And I pray that you continue to seek out resource and help where you need it, and share with your friends.